Hi all, this is our first week on surveys, designing surveys. What is the role of surveys in research? One, it's the most commonly used sociology method, and it's a form of mostly quantitative research that can be analyzed statistically, one of its greatest strengths. It usually uses close-ended questions where possible answers are provided, true, false, A, B, C, or D, and so on. It's more like a multiple choice test rather than an essay test as interviews were. There are five major modes of surveys. There's mail surveys, which are essentially self-administered. You mail it out, and unfortunately, it's often a low response rate and expensive to actually get done in a way that's actually effective. There are online surveys over the internet, relatively inexpensive, but with a high sampling bias, although there are ways to get greater accuracy, especially in recent years, as we'll talk about. There are phone surveys, expensive to conduct, and there are problems of caller ID, mobile phones, but it overall has relatively high responses and is one of the most popular methods for doing broad-based surveys. There are face-to-face surveys where you set up interviews, go out to people's homes and talk with them one-on-one. This is the most expensive way to conduct a survey, but it has the highest response rates, allows for more complex designs with the broadest sampling, and is generally considered the most accurate and reliable way to do a survey. There are take-home surveys. You leave them out on a table at a library or other places, and they get sent in by people if they decide to send it in. It's the cheapest way to do a survey, but often has very low response rates and often unrepresentative of the overall population you're interested in surveying. This is, and from your book, a sort of comparison of the major survey modes of delivery, where how is it administered? What's its expense compared to other surveys? Is it good for asking sensitive questions? That's one place where take-home surveys are often better because people are willing to just write it in, send it back anonymously in ways that even when they feel it's anonymous, a phone survey they might not be as comfortable with. Can you do complicated questions, skip patterns? What is the response rate? And again, face-to-face interviews probably have the best response rate. Do you have a quick turnaround time? What's the sampling bias? And are people willing to do long surveys in that mode? And again, face-to-face surveys, for a lot of reasons, in person, people are willing to sit for the longest surveys face-to-face, which is why the General Social Survey, which we'll be dealing with later in this semester, uses face-to-face because they ask very long sets of questions and get very robust responses. So what is the methodology for surveys? It's usually based on a positivist methodology that seeks scientifically approached research. The idea being you start with a hypothesis and you test it against data in support of those hypotheses. It's a deductive kind of research. You start with all the ideas you have about how you think people are going to answer and gather data to test those deductions. The key goal is to create replicable results that other researchers can repeat or challenge in their research. The point being that whoever does the survey research should not affect the results. You're trying to stand in and get results that reflect a whole population, not some subset. So if that's how the whole population feels, anybody doing similar research should get similar or the same results. The goal is an objective study without research bias that might affect the collection of the data. Now, nothing's perfect. How do you avoid bias in surveys? The biggest area of bias comes in how you word questions. That may encourage one answer over another. You want to make sure you're asking the questions in ways that are relatively neutral and encourage people to take either the true or false A, B, C, or D based on their beliefs, not in any way you've biased the question. The bias on that basis can come in the ordering of questions, where one question asked earlier in a sequence can influence the answer in a later one. Sampling methods can also lead to biased results. If you're not truly getting a random sample or a sample that represents the overall population, you're not going to have results that are reflective and thus are biased. Relationships established during a survey are formal. The rapport is very different from interviewing, since rapport that makes you feel friends with the person you're surveying could be itself a source of bias in a survey. Survey researchers refer to respondents, not participants as interviewers often do. The goal is to treat all respondents exactly the same way, same tone of voice, same questions asked, everything as similar as possible. The emphasis is on completely scripted interactions. One reason why computer surveys done over the phone have tended to give relatively accurate responses, since when you have human beings, they're in many ways encouraged to be nearly robotic in their approach to answering questions and asking them. So, what is the key goal of a survey? It's representative results, results that reflect the overall population. Anything you say in a survey, you want to be able to say if 30% of people answered one way, you're hoping that means, if done correctly, that 30% of the whole population believed the same thing. You use information about a few people to say useful things about a whole group. And to get this, the sample of people surveyed must be as close to random among the group surveyed as possible. Now, what are appropriate survey research questions? Since you're asking about a sort of narrow set of possible answers, you have to have questions that are defined. You can assess demographic characteristics, social trends over time, attitudes, self-reports of simple behaviors, levels of knowledge, and to some extent, cause and effect. You can understand how demographic characteristics such as age or race can affect attitudes or behaviors, even in many cases when the individual respondents might not perceive such an effect. You seek to understand the relationship between two or more factors or phenomenon, the variables, the questions asked, or to understand how one may be affecting another. Note, in this circumstance, the variable is any characteristic you can measure, and that can differ from one person to another in a sample. So from your broader research question, you're going to generate hypotheses. You're going to make guesses about the relationship between two variables, and in this case, the variables are any of the questions you ask. If you ask about people's beliefs about climate change and you ask them about their race, you may implicitly have a hypothesis that people of one race may believe in the problem of climate change more than people of another race. You want to be clear and specific on that or any other hypothetical relationships that you expect to see in the data at the end. Think of how different groups of respondents are likely to answer any of the questions you're asking based on any of the variables, and it can be how they answer one question may correlate with how they answer another question. Those variables exist as well. Here are some examples of research questions appropriate for survey research. For example, what are students' attitudes about a proposed new fee increase? And that's looking at attitudes, and you might be looking at, are richer students more concerned than poorer students? What's the relationship between social class and religiosity? Do people of different economic strata have different degrees of going to church? What are the television viewing habits of the elderly? Do they differ from younger people? How does race affect the likelihood that students will finish their college education in 4 years? That's in some ways trying to get at some cause and effect. This is from a textbook, but it's an example of a research question and some corresponding hypotheses, with many of the hypotheses likely to correspond to questions you're going to ask in the survey. So the overall research question is, what demographic characteristics affect condom use amongst unmarried men? So one hypothesis, men in monogamous heterosexual relationships are less likely to have used a condom the last time they had sex than men not in a monogamous heterosexual relationship, which raises a couple questions you want to ask in the survey. One, are you in a heterosexual relationship? Is it monogamous? Have you used a condom, in the last, few months? Then you might have another hypothesis. Men between the ages of 30 and 50 are more likely to have used a condom the last time they had sex than men under 30 or over 50. Now, why might that be? Well, if you're between 30 and 50, you're more likely to be having sex potentially than people over 50. And if you're over 50, you're less likely to be fertile. You may be shooting blanks at that point as far as you know, and so you may drop off on your use of condom use. The hypothesis here is people under 30, while they may be having sex, they're less responsible, or at least that's the hypothesis. So you're definitely, in this case, going to have a question about how old are you? There's also a hypothesis about men who have sex exclusively with men are more likely to have used a condom the last time they had sex than men who have had sex exclusively with women. Now, you have a question already about heterosexuality, homosexuality, but you might want to have a refining question on, is that exclusive? Do you only have sex with men as opposed to, or do you identify as heterosexual versus homosexual? Very important to think about these questions, that just because you say, are you homosexual, does that mean that it's exclusively? And so these kinds of hypotheses may help you refine which questions you want to ask. They also have questions about African American men are more likely than Latino men to report that they've used condoms every time they've had sex in the past month. That's a hypothesis, but they're then going to have to ask about people's race and so on. So, as you can see, by having a whole series of hypotheses, it helps imply a whole series of questions you need to ask in your survey. What kind of literature review helps you do a survey? First of all, you'll review other studies that may be similar to the one you're interested in that may help you focus your research question. It may help identify variables that should be included. And it may help you identify variables that weren't included under other studies. So there gives you an idea of, hey, I should ask this question because most people haven't, and it'll be new knowledge. What it does is help you operationalize any concept, what you want to measure. If you want to measure degree of feminism in the population, what questions do you ask that capture how feminist somebody is, whether a man or a woman? There are different questions you could ask, and other studies might have contemplated this and have ideas on the best way to measure degrees of feminism. Another thing, what counts as class in a survey? Is it money? Is it education? Is it some combination? Is it the kind of work people do? There are, again, different concepts and different ways to measure that. And so you want to look and think which is appropriate for the overall research question you're asking. So what this does is you can review a whole set of existing measures of variables and think about which one works for you. And when you get your results, having looked at the literature review, if you get results that are similar, you add to reinforcing whatever hypotheses, rules people seem to think are in the literature, or if you find a result that contradicts them, that's new knowledge that's worth embedding and showing how it compares to past research. This goes to the broader question of conceptualizing and operationalizing in surveys. Unlike in interviews or observation research, conceptualization and operationalization for survey research is a separate and distinct stage of the research process. You really have to do all of your thinking about concepts and variables before you ask a single question in the field, because you're not going to be able to refine it. You really want to get all of those questions down. Once you get those concepts down, the variables, the questions you're going to ask, that's it. You've locked it in, and then you do the work of doing the surveys. In this sense, conceptualize is the definition you use for any abstract concept: social class, academic success, support for abortion. And then you pick variables that map onto those concepts. That's how you operationalize the concept. And you construct survey questions based on variables to measure those variables, and that are valid measures of that concept. Now, having picked a variable, how are you going to measure different answers? And there's a couple of different ways to do it, especially quantitatively. There are nominal measures. These are either-or measures, such as what state do you live in? What's your religion? These are ones where if you live in New Jersey, you don't live in California. People may travel, but people at some level have what their home base is. There's ordinal measures. These are ones that can be ranked, where they're different, but one is considered a successor to the other, higher than the other, say the highest degree earned. We consider a college degree something you get after a bachelor's degree, a master's degree something you get after the college degree, and so on. There's interval measures. Those are variables with precise numerical measures. Grade point average, what your age is. All of these are numerical averages that can actually be compared to other measures numerically. There are also more complicated ratio measures. These are variables that can be related to one another against a baseline of 0. Crime rates, like crime per 100,000 people, and various other measures that can be compared to each other, and the crime rates in some ways have intervals, but they also have relationship between multiple variables, often within your survey itself. How you can measure variables affects how you can ask questions. You usually want to ask the most specific question, even if you group answers together later for analysis, i.e., ask people's exact age. And then if you want to group people by 18 to 25, 26 to 35, that's fine. But it's more useful to have each individual age for each individual respondent, because if you decide to change how to group them, you have the raw data. You may want to ask how many hours people worked last week, another example, and then group it into 1 to 10 hours, 11 to 20 hours, 21 to 30 hours. Most people have a pretty precise sense of how many hours they worked, but there are other things that if you ask them how many hours a week they worked 5 years ago, you might do it in this grouping because they might not have as precise knowledge about how many hours they worked a week 5 years ago as they did last week. When asking nominal or ordinal measure questions, response categories need to be exhaustive and exclusive, meaning if they answer one answer, they shouldn't be able to answer another. Now, you're going to end up with problems. If you ask about people's race, some people are mixed race, and you're going to have to figure out what categories they go into. Do you have a mixed race category, or do you push them to choose one or the other? Now, what do you want to avoid when writing survey questions? Main thing is avoid biased wording, what are often called loaded questions, ones that push an answer rather than giving people the freedom to answer as they would have on their own. You also want to avoid threatening questions that make people either feel bad about themselves or make them scared about anonymity questions like, do you abuse your children? Far better just to ask, how do you discipline your children? Avoid double-barreled questions that ask two things at once. Instead, ask two separate questions. Don't say, do you receive food stamps and earned income tax credit? It's far better to ask those individually, because maybe they get one but not the other, and being asked about both can confuse the question. Avoid double negatives. Should we avoid prohibiting the exclusion of non-Muslims from losing the status of being refugees? Okay, that's convoluted, but there are less convoluted versions that are still hard for people to separate out when there's too many negatives in the sentence. So things to do positively when writing survey questions. Only ask questions people know or can easily remember. Make questions specific. Ask people to name 5 favorite shows, not what do you watch on TV. Keep questions short. Let people skip questions not relevant to them. That's known as a skip question. For example, if you ask early on, are you a Democrat, Republican, or Independent? And then you're going to ask, how do you vote in the primary? You don't have to ask Republicans how they vote in the Democratic primary and vice versa. When there are a series of similar questions, you can mix in some other questions to avoid repetitive responses. You don't want to get people into the mode of yes, yes, yes. You want to make sure that they're really thinking about each question you ask. You may also want to include a neutral answer in any set of options, such as neither agree or disagree. But at other times, you may want to push people into a decision. That's a judgment call. Should you include a don't know or does not apply? Again, anybody who goes into that category, they're de facto out of your sample as far as options of yes or no on your core question. Don't just ask, do you agree with whatever question it is? It's better to give people 2 positive options. On an abortion question, it's better to ask, do you believe that life begins at conception and needs to be protected? Or do you believe that women's privacy needs to be protected and we need to support the right to abortion? Giving 2 positive options are better than giving 1 positive and putting another position in the negative. Now, I had you read Howard Schulman's Sense and Nonsense About Surveys, and he has a number of good points about both sampling and about how to ask questions. He notes that there are 2 impulses that drive surveys. Asking questions continues to be an effective way of acquiring information of all kinds about people. The other key draw is the sampling aspect of surveys. Can you get something representative of the larger reality, the larger population in our society? Now, the thing to understand is only in the 1930s, 1940s were improvements made in sampling that we had any kind of accurate kind of sample. One of the things that people got in that period was that recognition that the size of the sample was not the most important issue. How you got the sample was far more important than how many people you questioned. Bigger samples are better than smaller samples, but how you get the sample ended up being more important. He tells a famous story. In 1936, one of the major magazines of the day, what was called the Literary Digest, did a poll based on 2 million questionnaires that were mailed back to the Literary Digest. They did a lot of work getting it out there. They had done this for years earlier and had had pretty good results. And the 2 million people who mailed back said Franklin Delano Roosevelt would lose that election decisively. Now, at the same time, a young man called George Gallup, you may have heard of the Gallup poll, but nobody had back then, had a smaller sample, but had a better method, and he predicted that FDR would win the election. Now, the problem was the Literary Digest used telephones and auto ownership lists to send out their questionnaires. The problem was back in the 30s, there was actually a chunk of people who didn't own telephones and didn't own cars, which meant that the Literary Digest survey was biased towards wealthier people. And in the election of 1936, poorer people broke decisively for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which the Literary Digest completely missed. So, this is why you need to think about getting a representative result. Are you getting what's called a probability sampling? Essentially, a size of sample is not the key issue. Do you have essentially a random sample? Here's a rule of thumb. Roughly a sample size of 1,000 is needed for the best representative results. If you can get somewhat more than that, the General Social Survey does more than that and is considered one of the gold standards. But what's considered generally a solid national opinion poll has 1,000 respondents because what's known as the margin of error, meaning the likelihood that it's not representative, gets relatively small at that point. The flip side is small samples are not representative even of small populations. You might think, oh, well, I only have a city of 2,000 people, so I can do a relatively small sample that's representative of them. Not so true. If you have 100 people sampled in a city of 2,000, that's far less accurate and representative than a sample size of 1,000 for the whole United States. You know, I have at least one video up that goes through some of the mathematics of this, but it goes to the general idea that the more times that you sample, the more likely any, probability cancels out over time. That if there was a mistake, if you do 1,000, essentially it's like reaching into a bag of marbles that are black and white. The first time you dip in, it's going to be black or white. If you do two of them, the chance that they're both white is reasonably likely. But over time, if you do 1,000 pulls out of that bag and keep putting them back, you're going to end up with roughly a representative sample of the number of white versus black marbles. This is the idea behind the mathematics of probability sampling. But along with seeking to get it to be random, you need a good method for sampling as well. If you miss whole groups of people, as the Literary Digest did, or people don't answer key questions, the study won't be representative. Now, sampling from telephone directories, even now, means you can miss those with unlisted telephones or no telephones. And you also have the bigger problem these days of refusal rates in taking surveys. That when Schumann talked about it, it was like 25% were refusing to answer phone calls. Now it's far, far higher. Large numbers of people refuse surveys, and even more are just impossible to reach. And then there's the form and wording of questions. Those can affect survey results as well. Now, this seems a simple difference, but if you use the word forbid, say, should we forbid something in our society versus should we allow it, they seem like mirror images of themselves, but you get radically different results. For example, 75% of the public would not allow speeches against democracy, but only 54% would forbid them. Those results are really about the same policy question, but they get very different results because people are more comfortable not allowing things than forbidding them. So it's important to think about the words you're using. Sometimes people doing surveys administer multiple wordings to see how dependent the results are on wording or whether there's more consistency. And you can get different results from more open-ended questions than from set choices that you give people. Quite often, you'll see conflicts in findings amongst surveys, and it sounds like, oh my God, people aren't like getting even the same sample of people in the universe, but they can be from the same group of people sampled, but just conflicts in wording that can be subtle if you're not paying attention. So what are the solutions to wording problems? One thing is you look at trends over time, not absolute percentages. As long as you use the same word over 10 years, 20 years, the trends tend to be in the same direction, even with different wordings. So if you're less interested in the absolute percentage who want to forbid, speeches against democracy, but just see if are we more or less supportive of people speaking out, you can see that trend better, even as long as the wording was consistent in questions over time. And distinctions across different groups also seem to parallel the different wordings. So as long as you're trying to understand, are older people versus young people less or more supportive of whatever policy issue, the absolute percentage may not matter, but they may be like the fact that old people are twice as likely to answer is still a significant difference. And you can see that even if the exact percentage isn't as important. And you can ask different questions about the same issue to get greater reliability to see if you do have consistency with different approaches to the same question. One thing you need are comparisons to comparable situations and to other surveys over time and populations. That's where literature reviews can help, because you can compare your wording, your results to other results over time or different places.